Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. This is your spot to get inspiration, tips, stories, and guidance to help you in your legal nurse consulting practice. I'm Pat Iyer, the host of Legal Nurse Podcast since 2016. We are among the top 5% of all podcasts in the world in terms of longevity and sharing information consistently week after week with legal nurse consultants. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. My name is Pat Iyer, and my guest today is Rachel Toland. We're going to focus drawing on her background as the owner of Moonstruck Legal Nurse Consulting. She's an independent LNC. She has extensive experience working in the areas of nursing, leadership, and case management. We're going to be going into one of the most valuable roles of legal nurse consultants, and that is looking at how we interact with people in the workers' compensation system to help make sure that workers are getting the benefits that they're entitled to or not getting benefits that they are not entitled to. Let's get started, Rachel. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Pat. It's an honor.
Some of our listeners are going to be from countries that may not be familiar with the term workers' compensation. I wanted to start, first of all, with an understanding of the basics. What is this system and how does it fit within the legal system?
Absolutely. Workers' compensation is essentially where healthcare and statutory law combine. It's a medical legal ecosystem, essentially. With workers' compensation, you obviously are working with someone who is employed and injured on that employment potentially, and looking at causation, compensability, cost containment is a large part of workers' compensation. And looking at that work-related injury, the treatment, getting authorized the appropriate treatment, as you alluded to, and potentially looking down the road at impairments.
One of the things I learned when I started working on personal injury cases is that there's a whole host of people in the background. Mm-hmm. It's not just the drivers of the two cars. It's the insurance claims adjuster, the defense attorney, the risk manager, the employer, the chiropractor and the orthopedist, the medical illustrators, the accident reconstructionist, the legal nurse consultants, the expert witnesses, the treating and non-treating and DME. Tell us about the characters who are involved in the workers' compensation system. And I'm not using the term characters in a disparaging way. Who are the players? And they're not necessarily playing a game. Who are the people? Let's just who are the people?
Who are the people? You outlined it very well. It is really a multidisciplinary system when it comes to workers' compensation. And you do have, with any medical legal case, you've always got multiple, we'll use the word players, like you said, it's nothing disparaging, but it's people involved. And it's, the injured worker is at the center of that. Their employer, depending on the employer, if they have their own legal team, you've got plaintiff defense potentially involved with that. You've also got the insurer. If the employer is either self-insured, many times you'll see that, and they have their own internal adjusters, or are they using what we call a TPA or third-party administrator, where they've got an insurance company that manages their workers' compensation benefits. And oftentimes within that insurance company, there are adjusters. There's potentially a legal team. That's all encompassed. And then you also have the medical providers. You may have a case manager, which obviously I have background as a board certified case manager, but you've got providers, you've got primary treating providers, you've got IME providers potentially. So there's lots of irons in the fire, if you will, when it comes to a workers' compensation claim, lots of moving parts.
And one of those moving parts is the legal nurse consultant who is assisting in this. Give us a sense of the different roles that a nurse could play.
Yeah, a legal nurse consultant really, the role that we're familiar with in reviewing medical records, medical timeline development, really becomes a vital role because with workers' compensation, because there are so many players, because there are so many moving parts, and oftentimes these injuries and the treatment of them span a very long time. Sometimes injured workers will change providers. So the legal nurse consultant is really playing a role looking at is causation clear? Really, clarifying what was the causation, what was the injury timelines, what's the treatment been? Has treatment diverged from that accepted and compensable body part? Then looking down the road, I mentioned impairment ratings. And so looking at those impairment ratings, were they done appropriately? Are they appropriate to what the injury was, what the accepted injury was, the body part? There are guidelines, there are AMA guidelines when you're looking at impairment ratings. And then ultimately MMI, which is maximum medical improvement. That's, kind of seen as that gold standard of the claim nearing completion because the injured worker has a statement from a provider that they reached maximum medical improvement. Well, as an LNC, I can look at that, also having, my case management certification, I can look at that to really evaluate that MMI. Is it appropriate that they have a statement of MMI given, or has it been delayed and it shouldn't have been delayed, or do we need to look at additional future medical?
You mentioned impairment rating, and that's probably a term that's not going to be comprehensible to everyone without a little more explanation. What does that mean?
So when we talk about impairment rating, we're looking at the nature of injury. And the first thing that you really have to look at is what was their previous level of functioning. You'll see that abbreviated PLOF. And we're really looking at what was their baseline, looking at job descriptions, functional demands, lifestyle habits, demands, pre-injury medical status. Because from a workers' compensation perspective, what was their baseline prior to the injury? And we want to get them back to that. Were they out playing golf? Were they playing baseball, coaching baseball with their kids? Obviously we want to get them back to their previous level of functioning. And part of that, once we reach that, is when we look at maximum medical improvement. But if we don't get there and the medical providers determine that we may not get there, then we may look at an impairment rating. And depending on the jurisdiction, those impairment ratings are done differently. Jurisdictions meaning different states. Those are done differently, and they hold different weight depending on the jurisdiction. But that's really where they're going to assess that they have a partial or permanent disability and a certain percentage of disability. And that's what that impairment rating is.
So to take an example, I spent a lot of time on medical surgical units, pulling patients up in bed before there were lifting devices available. And I developed some back pain as a result of that. If I developed an acute flare of back pain from a particular incident, that would take me into a state where I couldn't work for a while. And then to return to a previous level of functioning might be the chronic back pain that I had. The treatment brought me back to a level of chronic, but it didn't bring me back to totally pain-free. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good description. And what you're also describing, which I think is a good thing to outline, is what we call cumulative injury. And that's another piece of workers' compensation where we look at, it isn't just I fell and tore my rotator cuff. Sometimes those injuries are the result of cumulative injuries, such as back injuries like nurses can sustain, carpal tunnel injuries, things of that nature too.
Then why not just keep treating and treating and treating and treating in the hopes of getting a person back to their previous level of functioning?
That is where the tangled web of workers' compensation really exists, is that, we want to be judicious in a steward of finances and also make sure that the injured worker is getting the care that they're due. So there's a balance there for sure. But I would say that that's a large part of some of the stickiness that comes into workers' compensation claims.
And is this a uniform system that is the same in every state?
It's not. Each state, every state is different. That's, the 50,000-foot view. There are some states that are state mandated. So if you think about it as 50 mini state, universes, some are state administered, Washington and Ohio off the top of my head. Then there are some that have private insurance carriers. So that's where the definitions with MMI come into play, where impairment rating can diverge from state to state. Utilization review is required in some states it's not. So Kentucky is a state where utilization review is required for ordered treatments such as physical therapy, MRI, CTs. So that just adds another layer. It's another one of those players, if we go back to when we started, that plays a role in potentially delaying or having a heavy impact on the claim for the injured worker.
If a company is self-insured,
Mm-hmm.
what are the implications for them financially for a worker who needs more treatment and can't return back to work or can't return back to their job? How does that affect the finances of the company that's self-insured?
It can have a significant impact because they are self-insured. They aren't going through, the third-party administrator. The other thing I've seen with self-insured is there is a very close relationship with the injured worker because they are obviously an employee of the company, but then the people that are managing the claim, the internal adjusters, are also employees of the company. So that can create a rub, if you will, in spending the money, in allocating the resources. That's where I would say case management or a case management mindset is really important when we're looking at cost containment.
And there's a certain level of cynicism, Rachel, in this field, because there are people who claim to be injured but are not. Can you give us a sense of what sources of evidence might be available to a legal nurse consultant? I know medical records, but
Yep.
what else?
Yep. Social media. Social media follows you wherever you go. That's the first one I can think of, whether it's Facebook or, different social media that you can post videos. Those things can all be found if they're out there and if they're on the internet. I think of a case that I had been a part of where an injured worker developed something called CRPS, which is chronic regional pain syndrome. And this particular person, it was the left lower extremity. Well, if you know about chronic regional pain syndrome, part of that is something called allodynia, which is just exaggerated, very, very intense pain to very even light touch on a certain body part. And so this particular person with CRPS and the reported allodynia, but then on social media had pictures, particularly of the foot wearing stiletto heels, which truly with the allodynia and where it was located would not have even really been able to tolerate a flip-flop. And so those are things that, depending on how deep, the plaintiff or defense attorney might look, those are things that need to be taken into consideration.
It reminds me of the expression of don't put anything on social media that you wouldn't want to put on a billboard that would be permanent. You'd be driving down the highway and you'd be telling the entire world what you were doing.
True. There is also surveillance that's done. That's another piece that I think is really prevalent in workers' compensation, is having private investigators hired to obtain surveillance to validate if an injured worker needs to use, a cane for ambulation, things of that nature. So those are probably the two big things that I would say we see brought into consideration when we're looking at the whole medical picture.
For our listener who's not familiar with the concept of hiring a private investigator to do surveillance, what do they do?
Typically, they're a third-party contract, and they, if they are hired by, we'll say, the defense, then the defense is going to be very specific about offering maybe where there is appointment times or physical therapy or opportunities to observe the injured party, and very specific criteria on what we're looking at, what, body part are we considered just general observations. So those are the types of things that they will then, be out in the public as a plain dressed person, very, unassuming, and making those observations to see if they can validate the reported injuries, essentially.
So I have this vision of a person in a white van who's just sitting there waiting for the person to leave the house.
Yeah, no, usually much more unassuming than that. Probably just a standard Honda Accord or something that just blends in.
And I do know that plaintiff attorneys sometimes tell their clients to be prepared for the fact that there may be somebody watching them as well.
Yep.
And that they have to be honest and not be inconsistent with what they are saying that they can't do.
Very true. Very true.
We've also become a world where cameras are located in places that never were located before. Can you give us a little bit of detail about what you might have seen or heard about regarding cameras capturing people?
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind the most is in particular the transportation agencies out there that have drivers who drive, all the way across the United States. Nearly all of those vehicles have dash cams, and those dash cams are not only pointed at the driver, but they're also pointed ahead at what the vehicle is driving towards or driving in. And so both plaintiff and defense can obtain information from that in the driver themselves. Were they distracted driving? Do they have their seatbelt on? But then also that forward facing and truly getting a firsthand account of what the accident might have been. Did the oncoming car cross the center line, or did something come off a passing vehicle that then came through the windshield? I've seen all of that in cases. And so that becomes another critical piece of information when you're putting that entire picture and chronology together.
It's an interesting example, Rachel, because we hire drivers to take our cars from New Jersey to Florida. Earlier this year, I hired a driver to take our car from Florida to Colorado to my godchild who purchased the car. And we put an air tag in the car. And we could tell exactly when that car was traveling, when it had stopped. We know he spent 2 days in a casino parking lot in Shreveport, Louisiana. We did get a picture that was taken through the windshield to tell us, yes, we're on the road and we are going to pick up your car right now. So that was taken from the camera. I knew when he ate. I knew when he stopped. I knew where he ate. And he had no idea that I was tracking him across the country because I chose to not reveal that information. And meanwhile, my goddaughter is on the other end saying, when's the car going to come? When's it come? Well, right now it is in Texas and it's on its way to you. So it was fascinating to think about the technology that we never had before, that we can air tag children, vehicles, purses, suitcases, at least in terms of location. We're not going to get pictures, but we can track people that way.
You're not wrong. And it's a really good example of, you just never know. There is so much that can be done with technology, and probably things that you and I sitting here don't even realize different modes of technology that they're using, because it's a constant evolution.
And the cameras can be disguised as pens, hooks that are affixed to the wall, alarm clocks, stuffed animals. There are cameras concealed in places that we have no idea where they are.
Very true.
I think it's fascinating to know that there is so much ability to observe somebody and to verify that they are accurate in what they are saying, and how that technology is playing into making sure that people are compensated who are injured, and, as we said in the beginning, are not making fraudulent claims of injury.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taking it from the technology perspective, as a legal nurse consultant, what are some of the things that you're looking for in the medical records?
You know, with the workers' compensation claims, the thing that's a little bit different, and I will sort of put it out there, my expertise in particular, not just being an LNC, but being board certified case manager, the lens that I look through is really the meld of the pre-existing to the current injury, but taking into account the compensable body part and really narrowing down, are we focused on that compensable body part? Are we starting to diverge and look at more that's maybe, not related and more related to pre-existing? Looking at erroneous billing is another thing with workers' compensation. Some particular states have what's called ATP, or approved treating provider, and that has to be provided to the injured worker in a panel. And that is a list of providers that they're allowed to choose for treatment. In some states, there's guidelines on when that has to be made available to the injured worker. They select a treating provider. And so that knowledge for me as an LNC, I can look at what state we're in, what jurisdiction, is it a panel state? And then work with that attorney to really identify, is the medical records and the provider that we're looking at an approved treating provider? Because there are a lot of times where injured workers, they'll initiate treatment with their PCP, or they'll initiate treatment with the approved treating provider, but then they're still seeing their PCP, and they're really wanting to follow the orders of their PCP. But in that workers' compensation claim, it has to be the approved treating provider. And that piece is a critical starting point to look at when you're looking at these records. So it isn't just putting together this timeline, making this very meaningful, well thought out chronology, but you're also looking at, are the providers that are there approved? And that's a different factor than there is in the typical LNC chronologies and medical reviews. So that's something that I look at. Also looking at, Ohio, for an example, they have very specific claims through their state system. Doctor's orders are considered what's called a C9. And if there are orders the doctor wants, they have to be submitted on a C9, and they have to come from the approved treating provider. If a doctor wants to add a diagnosis, they have to submit a C86. So there's lots of intricacies within the workers' compensation world that we aren't just looking at the medical records. There's a whole another layer to look at from an LNC lens that's critical and valuable to the attorneys if you have that knowledge base.
And in our example, as we talked about earlier, the rules vary from state to state. Suppose the driver of that transport vehicle gets injured in Texas, but their home base is in Florida. They live in Florida, as was the case for the driver that I hired. How does that different jurisdiction affect the system?
That's where, partnering up with the attorney client is really important for me as an LNC, because understanding exactly that, where did the injury occur, and are we going under the jurisdiction of the injury state? Sometimes, especially, this transportation is a great example. Sometimes the jurisdiction that we're treating within is the home address of the company. So you might have an injured worker that lives in Florida, but they're working for a company based out of another state. They were injured, say in Nebraska, where I'm at. And so really understanding from the attorney, what's our jurisdiction? Are we treating in the home base of the company? Are we treating where the injured worker is? Are we treating where the injury occurred? So those are really important considerations. And then the next layer of that is, if we're treating whatever jurisdiction we're going to treat in, do the providers understand that? If we're treating in, if it's happened in, I think you said Florida was your example. If it happened in Florida, but we're treating in Nebraska, do the Nebraska providers understand that we need to treat under Florida jurisdiction? Because do we have the injured worker travel back and forth to Florida for treatment? So that just adds another layer of complexity that's really obviously important for the attorneys to sort out and make sure that, as the LNC, I understand where we're at, because that will guide my lens that I look at those records through.
It's very complex, Rachel.
It can be, especially with the transportation companies, for sure.
Oh, the moral of the story is, if you're going to get injured within 10 miles of your home. And you're working in that area. Oh, man.
Yeah.
I had two more questions for you. My next to my last question is, we think about how some of these injuries can occur, and some of them can be catastrophic. I have worked on several workers' compensation cases where there were severe injuries. I think about the man who fell into a vat of acid and survived, or the man who was working in a furnace and somebody didn't know that he was in there and turned on the furnace, or the guy who electrocuted himself accidentally at work, or the woman who was crushed against the wall by a truck that was backing up and didn't see her. We know that there can be huge anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress reactions from some of these injuries. How does that affect getting back to that maximum medical improvement level, or the prior level of functioning?
Yeah, and that's a very valid concern and consideration. I would take a step back in that, our mental health care system obviously is struggling across the United States, but in the workers' compensation world, that can have such a heavy impact on the trajectory of recovery. We know as nurses that having mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, PTSD from a catastrophic traumatic event has a heavy impact on how you recover, and to the degree with which you can recover. It impacts adherence to treatment regimens. It impacts how treatments are given. I think of an example that was a fall that resulted in a loss of consciousness, but it was the tail end, if you will, or another head injury in a long history of concussions and developing that post-concussive syndrome. But it was sort of that, like we talked about, cumulative injury. It was that injury that just led to a cascade of mental health issues with agoraphobia, fear of leaving the house, fear of doing anything because we might fall. And the impact that had professionally, personally, was huge. From a mental health perspective, it varies state to state. There are some states in workers' compensation that don't even recognize the mental health perspective, that it's not taken into consideration with compensability, if you will. There's some states, like I said, won't address it at all. There's some states that require proof of a physical injury that led to the mental health concerns. And so that can be, again, one of those very sticky places to get into, and how you handle that, especially if there's pre-existing mental conditions. And did we exacerbate pre-existing depression? Did we exacerbate pre-existing fears? And so figuring out, how do you treat it, and how do you get that injured worker back to a reasonable vocation and a reasonable return to work, and providing them still the care that they need.
You have shared with us just a small window of this complex world. We can barely scratch the surface of understanding this. I know that our listeners are going to have some questions for you at some point in the future. What would be the best way to be able to reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. I love connecting with people. So my LinkedIn profile, you can find me, Rachel Toland, on LinkedIn. I have a website. It's moonstrucklnc.com. And people can always email me, and it's Rachel, Rachel, at moonstrucklnc.com. So reach out, connect. I love to collaborate, and just especially within the workers' compensation world.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
You bet. Thank you.
You have started my head spinning thinking about all of these nuances. This is clearly a field that has its own set of rules, expectations, framework, technology, vocabulary, and it is an important part of helping people get back to work, and an area where your nursing background can be extremely helpful to attorneys, just in the ability to interpret and analyze medical records alone. That itself is so significant, much less all the other things that we have been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for you as the listener, hang on a few more minutes, find out what's coming up on Legal Nurse Podcast, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast, you'll hear from Rachel Toland, a nurse with extensive experience in the workers' compensation system and as a case manager. She's also a legal nurse consultant and the guest who just completed a podcast with me. Rachel, what are some of the major topics that you covered in your podcast?
Absolutely. Thank you, Pat. We talked about what is workers' compensation, who are all the individuals involved in a workers' compensation claim. We also talked about MMI and maximum medical improvement, determining impairment ratings, the role of an LNC in workers' compensation, and the variances state to state jurisdictions and how workers' compensation is handled differently in each state, and the importance of knowing those intricacies as a workers' compensation LNC.
Thank you, Rachel. Rachel's podcast is a window into this complicated world and shows you in an overview perspective how nurses can be so valuable to attorneys who are handling these claims. Be sure to catch your podcast on Legal Nurse Podcast. Thanks so much. Serving as an expert witness is one of the most challenging and rewarding roles a legal nurse consultant can take on. This episode explores the responsibilities and opportunities that come with testifying, from understanding the different expert witness roles, such as liability experts, life care planners, and Rule 1006 experts, to recognizing the importance of credibility and professionalism. Your reputation, demeanor, and ability to communicate clearly are as critical as your education and clinical experience. Many nurses hesitate to become experts because they fear cross-examination, but preparation makes a tremendous difference. Attorneys want their experts to succeed, and they provide the guidance necessary to reduce anxiety. The episode you're about to watch highlights how experts can overcome fear, maintain composure under pressure, and stay within their role. Key tips include being clear and concise, correcting inaccurate rephrasing of answers, avoiding nervous habits, and remembering that cross-examination is not personal. Beyond testimony, the script covers how to handle initial calls with attorneys and the importance of avoiding conflicts of interest, and the financial realities of expert witness work. Successful experts consistently meet deadlines, maintain clinical practice, and build credibility through professionalism and balance. Ultimately, legal nurse consultants who testify make a profound impact on clarifying complex medical issues for jurors and attorneys. Coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. Thank you for being part of the Legal Nurse Podcast audience. I'm delighted that you've joined us for this episode. Be sure to go to legalnursebusiness.com and get your free reports, look around the website, pick up some tools that will be useful for you in your legal nurse consulting practice. And be sure to join us for the next episode.